Vypněte si prosím v tuhle chvíli mikrofony.
Please, I will ask you to switch off your microphones for now. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is my pleasure to welcome you for the second section of our conference, which concerns monuments and monument care in Czechoslovakia and other Central European countries during the second half of the 20th century. Just for a short introduction, nowadays we are accustomed to deal with our problems by putting up new institutions, and these institutions are supposed the kind of magic to solve all our problems. In the second section of our conference, which is entitled Legislation and Institutions, we will look closely on this phenomenon. Yesterday, we talked about the architecture and urbanism by comparing the situation in the Czech lands and in other Central European countries to the north or northeast of Bohemia. Today, we will look in a different direction. We will see the comparison with countries to the east and southeast of the Czech Republic. Thanks to our guests that I will introduce shortly. And one piece of technical information, you can watch us, you can follow us on YouTube channels in Czech and in English. And we also kindly ask you to ask questions, to write questions to our guests into the chat boxes in both channels. We will have a Q&A session after all the talks at the end of the section. We will first hear the talk by Tomáš Kowalski, who is a member of Slovak Council in Bratislava. He has studied history of art at the Faculty of Arts on Bratislava University, and he currently works in research that concerns monument protection and also a history of culture, society, and politics. Dear colleague, you have the floor. And please don't forget to switch on your microphone. Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the topic of my lecture is to recapitulate the fundamental circumstances in the protection of monuments in Slovakia in the mid-20th century. It began in 1945, when from January to April, the Eastern Front passed through the Slovak territory, heading for Vienna and especially Moravia, marking a cataclysm of an unprecedented scale in this territory. During the Slovak Republic, the power to protect monuments belonged to the Ministry of Education in Bratislava. The resistance that emerged with the Banská Bystrica uprising in August 1944 formed its own system of public authority, which was influential for further post-war developments. It was led by the Slovak National Council and its central offices, the commissionership. The lower level was formed by the district national councils. It was the Education and Information Department, which in October 1948 was given a more comprehensive name, the Education, Science and Arts Department. The commissioner was responsible simultaneously to the National Council and to the central government in Prague. The post was held for 5 post-war years by the former writer and journalist Vladislav Novomeský. The actual preservation of the monuments was carried out by a small staff, which was still headed by the pre-war worker Vladimír Wagner, until he finally fell victim to the purges after the pressure of communist power escalated and was reassigned to a position in the museum and university teaching. Alžběta Ginterová-Majerová, who had worked at the Slovak National Museum during the war and compiled inventories of the monuments in 2 regions, became an important force in the commissionership after the war. Her story exceptionally demonstrates the tragedy of the times. Her husband was murdered in 1948 for his work in the service of the American consulate in Bratislava, and she herself was evicted to the countryside in 1952. The new chief of staff was Peter Michal Fodor, a conservator by training, although in reality it was more of a pose. But let us return to the chronology. The front passed through the central and western part of Slovakia in March 1945. This is how, for example, the castle in Viglaš, which was a fortification of the German Wehrmacht, burned down. Similarly, the Soviet bombing of Nitra on 26th of March 1945, there were otherwise no German soldiers, destroyed, among other things, the top of the Episcopal Church tower and claimed 345 civilian casualties. Bratislava was damaged earlier by bombing by the American Air Force, and the headquarters of the Slovak Museum suffered great damage. Perhaps the most extensive damage to the historic township was sustained by Kremnica, which was bombed by the Allies in the early months and was burned by the retreating Germans in March and April. The drawing anticipates events but documents a post-war reconstruction that one can loosely call planned. As probably the most serious war damage in the field of fine arts, we should mention the church in Čerín. Čerín was a village to the south of Banská Bystrica, and this village was also shelled in March 1945. The shots hit the presbytery completely covered with wall paintings, which were subject to restoration only 15 years ago. The subsequent restoration took place in 1947, 48 and 49 seasons, so the church survived 2 winters without covering. On this slide you can see a detailed information about the restoration, but it is not important now. Košice, as the largest city in eastern Slovakia, was not part of our territory during the war years. In 1943, the Hungarian administration evacuated the local museum and the equipment of St. Elizabeth Cathedral to the territory of Hungary, precisely to the village of Hejce, where they formed an underground shelter. Košice was taken over by Slovak authorities as early as February 1945. Later, on the 5th of April, the exiled President Beneš, the government of the National Front of Czechs and Slovaks, arrived there, and the Košice government program was proclaimed. During the year, the re-evacuation of monuments from Hungary took place. The last crates, containing statues and panel paintings of the main Košice altar, were characteristically intercepted by Hungarian border guards and did not reach Slovakia until 1946. After 3 years of exposure to unsuitable conditions, the panel paintings were subject to restoration during the following 2 decades, mainly led by the well-known Czech restorer Karel Veselý. The first contact between the Prague ministry and the ministry in Bratislava was initiated by the clerk Václav Mencel in July 1945. I would like to remind you that Mencel had been assigned to the Ministry of Education in Bratislava before March 1939 and left Slovakia from that precise position. Prague requested data on the war damage to Slovak towns and monuments, and at the same time offered him the possibility of publication in the revived periodical Zprávy památkové péče, the Monumentská News. What were the fates of Slovak monuments in the meantime? First of all, the approaching front and the evidence of impending Sovietization forced the former owners of the ranks of former nobility to abandon their property, hastily in a hurry with a minimum of the most necessary things. Finally, in February 1945, the Slovak National Council issued a decree on the confiscation of the property of persons that were defined as Germans, Hungarians, traitors and enemies of the Slovak nation of any nationality. It targeted agricultural property or large estates, the centers of which were manor houses or other monuments that were part of its land property. Immediately after the army, the monuments were looted by the local population. For example, the administrator of Brunovce manor house described his capture by the villagers so that he could not prevent the looting and destruction of furniture, library, or archival materials, or summon the police. Each of the manors presents a separate but very similar story. The fact remains that in 1946, the Commissionership of the Interior ordered house raids in villages with monuments and confiscated at least some of the looted property. Here you can see some of the documents from that time. The confiscated buildings, especially manor houses, were to be allocated for public utility purposes of either health, social welfare, education, or to expand the missing housing stock. Agricultural land was to be distributed to non-wealthy peasants or peasants' cooperatives. The demands of the local national committees are illustrated by the example of the village of Brodziany, where the manor park was demanded to be subdivided into building plots, and the area of the park would have remained barely at a third of its original size, just to state one example out of many more. The confiscated art property, works of art, paintings, libraries, objects or artistic crafts, was concentrated in several centers in each part of Slovakia. In a state of scarcity of means of transport, a purely salvage operation could not logically ensure minute records or even documentation, which consisted at most of brief inventory list. The confiscations and seizures were also conceived of as the handing over of artistic property to the people to whom it had previously been inaccessible in the enclosed estates or upper class, and were proposed as the basis for the Slovak National Gallery. Ironically, one of the works on display at the 1946 exhibition of paintings was stolen. The primary task of the state was to rebuild the war-torn economy and industry, which was simultaneously being nationalized. This framework included the building reconstruction of towns and villages, which was regulated by a decree of the National Council of the National Assembly of 22nd of October 1945, replaced by the following year by a national law. The reconstruction was also part of the so-called two-year plan during 1947 and 1948, which was followed by the later five-year plans. Building restoration was managed and planned by the state. In Slovakia, it was the State Planning and Statistical Office and the state building authorities. On the right, you can see the example of building restoration in the town of Kremnica. Perhaps the most extensive example of building reconstruction was the construction of the village of Delgard, the easternmost village in the Upper Hron Valley, which succumbed to fire during the fighting with the Germans. Out of almost 200 destroyed houses, mainly wooden houses, the building reconstruction produced 115 new buildings. It is symbolic that the village was already the site of another major construction before the transversal railway of the early 1930s, and it was also one of the several to lose its historic name, and during the communist period this village was given the name Švermovo. Major construction works, for example in Bratislava, continued and realized plans that had been proposed in previous decades. Thus, a new complex was built intended as the seat of the regional office in 1929 and as government quarter during the Slovak Republic. The Slavian hill above the town was designated as the central cemetery for fallen soldiers. The housing issue was solved during the two-year plan by the construction of a housing estate of 500 flats. Similarly, the town of Banská Bystrica, for example, received a new railway station with the construction phase actually lasting the entire 1940s, and finally, after another decade, being completed with decorations in the style of the socialist realism. Developments in the field of culture have mainly brought a series of legal measures that have modified or established the institutional base in the education and training department. The program stemmed from the manifesto of artists and scientists or the involvement of the commissioner, Novomeský. However, the vigor was hampered by the internal relations in the Czechoslovak state when the legislative and executive power in Slovakia became fully dependent on the central government in Prague and its organs during 1946. Every legislative proposal and even financial expenditure had to be agreed in advance with the central government. Thus, Slovakia was subject to Prague's centralization. For example, the nationalization of Slovak museums or the establishment of Fine Arts College, also with the restoration department, came after several years of negotiations. As in Bohemia, the historiography of the period under review has so far been mainly concerned with the National Cultural Commission, which was to administrate the confiscated property, the now constituted state cultural property. Despite the law from May 1946, the Slovak Commission was staffed with members only from June 1948, and the first monuments were taken into administration during the 1950s. The previously highlighted conflicts with the Department of Agriculture and Land Reform regarding claims to monuments were extended to the question of jurisdiction for their declaration as state cultural property, which was initially also directed to Prague. The Commission, in its own activities, administered the object, but in their use, it had to respect the status quo ante, for example, this concerned, for example, the tenants' flats. However, it tried to struggle for the appropriate use of the monuments entrusted to it, and the law did not allow for compromising exceptions. In the context of all his organizational activities, Vladimír Wagner developed a home art history, which he enriched in 1948 with a survey history, the second in his personal biography. Paradoxically or symptomatically, he had to denounce the new book on the basis of the reproaches of an idealistic starting point conforming to the bourgeois period. Formalism, lack of Marxist-Leninist conception, non-reciprocation of the results of Soviet science, and distance from the working class. The protection of monuments has long suffered from the problem of the lack of comprehensive regulation of this field in the form of a law. Efforts to legislate in the interwar period have been studied in particular by Dr. Uhlíková and Michal Novotný. At the end of 1945, the Education Ministry dusted off a draft Slovak law from 6 years earlier, but it decided to submit it to Prague Ministry, where it was shelved as premature. The Ministry of Unification drafted 4 separate laws for different types of monuments in 1948. The Ministry of Education, Sciences and Arts itself took the initiatives in the following years. However, its proposal was criticized because of the extent of the registration obligation, which was to be imposed on private owners of monuments. A decisive change to the organization of popular administration, including the decentralization of the protection of monuments, was brought about by the introduction of the county system from 1949 on. The regional national committees established in Slovakia in 6 cities became the bearers of all administration, while the protection of monuments always belonged to the so-called 4th Department for Education and Physical Education. The formation of regional people's administration bodies and the entrustment of responsibilities for the protection of monuments, which, however, had no background of professional staff, necessitated the establishment of the Monuments Institute as a professional body for the scientific organization of the protection, inventory, and research of monuments. Its scope essentially replicated that of the pre-war organization, but it lacked the power of state administration now held by the People's Administration, and the Monuments Institute was to provide assistance and advice. A proposal for a set of measures in the protection of monuments during the decade of the 1950s was conceived in the Ministry of Education by Václav Mencel at the end of 1949. The implicit impetus was the resources of the Unified Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, Reconstruction and Relief Program. Perhaps the most famous part was the selection of the 30 most valuable urban units, which have since been considered as heritage sites. The selection also took into account the degree of war damage, as evident from the additional attribution to the town of Kremnica. The disparity in the number of sites from different parts of the country led to a succession of other proposals, the first made by the Slovak Credentials Office, and others soon emerged from the research of the Monuments Institute. An important role in the management of the restoration of urban reserves was played by the so-called Reservation Commissions, which were formed by regional and local national committees. They also kept reservation books for the 3 eastern Slovak towns. They were prepared by Stavoprojekt Praha. A certain contradiction which resulted from the care of the People's Democratic State for the monuments of the defeated social classes and churches was used to evoke the contrast between the new epoch and the previous system. The monuments were transferred into the hands of the people, who were now entitled to use them for their needs, rest, and recuperation. One of the emphasized purposes of the monuments was their place in domestic and foreign tourism and patriotic education. Related to this was the creation of specialized publications, book series, and the establishment of the specialist periodical Monuments and Museums, Pamiatky a muzea. The period of the early 1950s, which was a time of persecution of the churches, also brought about the restoration of perhaps the most famous work of Slovak Gothic architecture, the main altar of St. James Church in Levoča. The feat
povedalo, že sa oltár musí reštaurovať. Keď už prišli reštaurátori, keď aj postavili lešenie, tak sa ozval okresný výbor komunistickej strany z Levoče a pochybnil účasť de facto znárodneného, že idú obnovovať práve.
The activity of a national enterprises in Levoča was put in doubt by national authorities. A similarly multi-year process was the startup of the Slovak National Gallery, which, despite the legal basis from the summer of 1948, struggled with the issue of staffing. The initial idea to involve Karel Šourek, the chief commissioner of the exhibition Old Art in Slovakia from 1937 in the gallery, was thwarted by his death. Therefore, a personnel union was formed with the National Gallery in Prague until finally its Slovak employee Karol Vaculík was appointed to head the first Slovak picture gallery, the Slovak Painting Gallery. The exhibition program initially emphasized 19th century art and the trend towards realism, with a clear search for the prerequisites for current socialist realism, and also favor the relationship of Czech artists to Slovakia, for instance, Manes or Mikoláš Aleš. A realistic direction was required, especially with the unprecedented monumentalization in the environment of Slovak towns and villages, now dedicated to the victims of recent war. Particularly in this context of the state monument administration, it is worth mentioning the expertise it provided in Slovakia in the surveys and restoration of medieval wall paintings. The first contact of this kind developed during the restoration of the church in Žehra, where the requested opinion was given by the director, Dr. František Petr, Dr. Vlasta Dvořáková, also joined the cooperation, soon continuing from the Cabinet for Theory and History of Art of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. These contacts between Czech and Slovak experts started during the restoration of the church in Žehra, as I was just saying. So at first, the requested opinion was given by the director František Petr, and it was also the Dr. Vlasta Dvořáková who joined the cooperation, soon continuing from the Cabinet for History of Art of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. The results of their work were very important, and it would take a whole conference to mention them all. So much for a brief overlook over the situation on Slovakia for the period until 1950. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Velice děkuji za přehled.
Thank you very much for this very clear overview that gave us the context, which is somehow different from what we know in the Czech lands. We will leave the discussion for the end of the whole session of the panel. And now let's move on to our next presentation, which will be given by Marko Špikić. He graduated in art history and comparative literature. In 1998, he is a professor at the Department of Art History at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Zagreb. His fields of study are history and theory of architectural conservation, antiquarian studies, reconstructions, and urban history. He published many books and articles, and he's also an active member of the Croatian Association of Art Historians, of the Croatian ICOMOS and ICOMOS International Scientific Committee. His talk will be about creating a system of monument care in Croatia after 1945. Dear colleague, the floor is yours.
Just a moment. I have some technical issues, just a moment. Okay. Can you see it? Just a moment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, but
I will just open it now.
Full screen.
Yeah. No? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Děkuji, dobrý den, dámy a pánové. Úvodem bych chtěl poděkovat organizátorům této konference za přijetí mé prezentace. Okay. Post-war conservation system in Yugoslavia bears specific features. While the country emerged from bloody civil war in the midst of foreign occupation, Marshal Tito's regime, after its triumph, prompted revolutionary measures. On the one hand, it adopted the Soviet ideological model, that is, until 1948, when Yugoslavia became Eastern Bloc's enfant terrible. On the other, it faced severe consequences of war. In order to achieve social harmony, communist authorities promoted the synthetic ideology of brotherhood and unity, creating 6 popular republics with increasing sovereignty and self-government. First 15 post-war years were marked by retaliation, radical social reforms, break with Stalin, and gradual liberalization and growth. Yugoslavia was transformed from pre-war dictatorship and collaborationist terrorist state in the times of war to industrialized socialist society with newly established and publicly approachable academic and cultural institutions. In the final months of war, the new regime introduced first legal document concerning protection of cultural heritage, issued in Belgrade on 20th of February 1945 by the People's Committee for the Liberation of Yugoslavia, decision on protection and care of cultural monuments and antiquities delivered its definitions of artistic and scientific objects, buildings of artistic and historical significance, public monuments, busts, paintings, libraries, and archives. This document prepared nationalization while prescribing the role of educational authorities and experts. Judging by its brevity, the decision could rather be considered an order coming directly from the committee's president and war commander, Tito. With just 8 paragraphs, it tended to prevent the export and scattering of objects, especially from private collections. Therefore, for 4 years, Croatian conservators had to cope with grave challenges: revival of bombarded towns, nationalization, and building of the system, without a concrete and elaborate set of legal instructions. This was the framework for the system's creation, aligned with political structure of the federation that provided republics with autonomous governments. The conservation service was organized according to its specific local or republican needs, which prevented the creation of a homogeneous professional system on federal level. Although it seems natural to assume that the new regime had absolute control, the premise of republican autonomy within federation enabled lasting professional independence. Once they were approved by the liberating forces, the experts could start their work. Prophetic political rhetoric was focused on social reforms, industrial development, and urban expansion. The presence of the past was only occasionally dealt with by the new political elite. So reading Tito's words addressed to Croatian academicians in Zagreb in 1947 on the need to, quote, clear our history of all forgeries and unnecessary admixtures, shows tendency to purify the past, selecting its acceptable components for envisioned political synthesis. Archival documents show that Croatian conservation system was designed by its personnel. Unlike the members of the partisan forces that prevailed in 1945, the employees of the Conservation Institute for the People's Republic of Croatia in Zagreb were active since 1941. Ljubo Karaman, Vito Fisković, Angela Horvat, Ana Dejanović, and Tihomil Stahuljak, all art historians, formed a founding group of the system. Karaman was a Viennese student of Max Dvorak, who after the First World War became conservator in his native Split. Along with Fisković, he became one of the key figures of Croatian art history and conservation of the 20th century. Forced to leave Split in 1941 due to Italian occupation, Karaman moved to Zagreb and remained there until his death. Fisković, on the other hand, studied in Zagreb during 1930s, but returned to Split and was active there. Initially, People's Republic of Croatia had two conservation institutes, or zavodi. The central one in Zagreb, entrusted with territory of the continental part of Croatia, and second, in Split, in charge of the coastal region of Dalmatia. After the Paris Treaty and obtaining of Istrian Peninsula from Italy in 1947, the third institute was established in Rijeka, with Karaman as director of the institute in Zagreb, Fisković administering the institute in Split, and Aleksandar Perc in charge of the Institute for Istria and Kvarnero in Rijeka. The system took shape. In the initial years, the three institutes had varying numbers of employees, from 6 to 10 in Zagreb and from 2 to 3 in Rijeka and Split. These figures show disproportion and practical difficulties. Since Austro-Hungarian and interwar periods, the region of Dalmatia was best researched, with contributions from Rudolf Eitelberger, Alois Riegel, Max Dvorak, Adolfo Venturi, Gustavo Giovannoni, and Luigi Crema. As autonomous part of the Kingdom of Hungary until 1918, continental Croatia was not included in the activities of the Viennese Zentralkommission. Until the establishment of the Provincial Commission for the Preservation of Artistic and Historical Monuments in 1910 in Zagreb, the heritage of the kingdoms of Croatia, Slavonia was studied by enthusiasts like Đuro Sabo, without institutional support, promoting the novel concepts of Denkmalpflege coming from Austria and Germany. Newly acquired Istria, located in the western part of the Republic. Annexed to Kingdom of Italy after World War I, it was terra incognita for most of Croatian art historians and conservators until 1947. Then the area, along with the islands of Kvarnero and coastal part between Rijeka and northern Dalmatia, was entrusted to a handful of young professionals, Aleksandar Perc, Iva Perčić, and initially Branko Fučić and Ferdinand Hauptmann. So, without a firm legal framework, in harsh conditions of the post-war years, among ruins of the bombarded areas, or in deserted towns of Istria after Italian exodus, conservators focused on registration of monuments and historic towns, war damage assessment, methodological preparation of reconstruction, and application for Republican or federal support. Until 1949, when the first law on conservation was passed, directors Karaman, Fisković, Perc, and their colleagues achieved significant results. In relation to the specifics of the regions, we can distinguish different degrees of practice, which combined respect for traditional methods and contemporary drive to revision. This inner dialectic imposed the dualist approach, ranging from perception, that is, careful maintenance of the status quo, to treatment, reconstruction as interventionist approach. How could these conservators, active in 3 different offices, organized their work within newly created borders of war-torn area exceeding 56,000 square kilometers? The answer lay in merging professional inheritance with a new political reality. On the one hand, they relied on help of honorary conservators, or instruments invented by the founders of Zentralkommission. On the other, they adopted the new concept of participation through people's committees, regulated by the Constitution in 1946. As nuclei of popular self-government, activities of the committees corresponded to administrative division into districts, municipalities, cities, and villages. The idea of merging the competence of regional conservation institutes with practical interests of the local communities was implied in the law on protection, cultural monuments, and natural rarities passed on 19th of October 1949. It expanded the definition of cultural monuments, now representing, quote, all movable and immovable objects or groups of objects, as well as architectural and urban sites of cultural, historical, artistic, or ethnographic character, or of special national importance, end of quote. This law had 33 paragraphs emphasizing scientific and aesthetic values. The holders of protection were institutes under direct supervision and guidance of the Ministry of Education. They were entrusted with inventory, registration, and prevention of, quote, excavation, relocation, remodeling, restoration, extension, demolition, or any alteration of cultural monuments. While paragraph 14th prescribes that all monuments and their environment, quote, must be accessible for scientific research and study. Paragraph 16 required that objects of particular importance should be, quote, accessible to general public. To implement this plan, institutes had to rely on people's committees' assistance. Paragraph 11 cites as follows. In order to preserve the urban or historical character or architectural ensemble of all towns and places, people's committees are obliged to consider the proposals of the competent Conservation Institute when adopting the regulatory plan, not to demolish or change squares, individual blocks of buildings, streets, or parts of the street, end of quote. Main concepts of the 1949 law were therefore intangibility of monumental ensembles, democratization of cultural heritage, and division of responsibilities. In their first legal document, conservators, however, omitted one of the biggest challenges: creation of methodological principles applicable to bombarded monuments and sites. Historic towns, mainly on the Adriatic coast, were damaged in bombardments by Axis and Allied forces. Krejčí, Rijeka, Senj, and Zadar experienced significant damages on urban level. Pula, Šibenik, and Osor had partial or total damages on central monuments, such as ancient Temple of Augustus, Venetian Loggia, and Renaissance Cathedral. Split, with its Diocletian's Palace, and Zagreb were only partially damaged. Among heavily demolished significant monuments in continental Croatia were Baroque complex in Lepoglava and neoclassicist manor of Januševec. So similar to Jan Zahvatovic's Warsaw, Hans Delgast's Munich, and Roberto Pane's Naples, Croatian conservators were compelled to devise a revision of the pre-war conservation theories. This implied acceptance of interventionist approach. The first to make an attempt in this field was Cvito Fisković in Dalmatia. While the question of Istria was still pending and Karaman's staff in Zagreb initiated assessment of war damage in the region north of Zagreb, Fisković descended among the ruins of Split and initiated work on the central monument, Diocletian's Palace. Discarding Giovannoni's concept from 1941 booklet, Roman Split, simply as fascist, in 1945, he initiated a process of liberation of the palace, more radical than his Italian predecessor suggested, turning the fascist veneration of Roman and Venetian heritage into favoring of local or Slavic masters is comparable with acts of conservators which during Polonization remodeled Danzig into Gdańsk and Breslau into Wrocław. On the other hand, using the ruinous state of the ensemble as an excuse to carry out reintegration by demolition of the eastern gate of the Diocletian's palace, he covertly followed Giovannoni's precepts and noble standards of critical restoration devised in Naples by Roberto Pane, who advocated abolition of everything that disguised or offended the monument's image of true beauty. Fisković inaugurated purifying interventions in favor of monuments' aesthetic integrity and adaptation of conservation procedures to modern life. Promoting the principles of subtraction and addition, he was suspicious of modern insertions in traditional settings. His results can be seen in Split, Korčula, where he supported bearing of the Venetian ducal tower, and Šibenik, where he advocated reconstruction of bombarded Renaissance loggia. His commitment to reconstruction proved to be crucial. As in Poland and Italy, Croatian conservators until 1950 envisaged, initiated, or completed complex reconstructions of nationally important monuments. That implied participation of conservation architects, Mladen Fučić, Greta Jurišić, Alexander Freudenreich in Zagreb, and Harold Bilinić from the Ministry of Construction within the domain of the Institute in Split. In the late 1940s, Bilinić prepared intervention on Šibenik and Zadar public lodges, cathedral in Senj, and on sacristy of the Šibenik Cathedral. So degrees of post-war interventions in damaged old towns can be distinguished as follows. First, reintegration of lacunae on damaged facades of the cathedrals in Osor and Senj, on loggia in Zadar, church in Lepoglava. Second, integral or facsimile reconstruction, loggia in Šibenik, Palace Vukasović in Senj, manor of Januševec, urban rehabilitation in Poreč, interpolation by architects Ivan Vitić in Šibenik and Neven Šegvić in Split, and new urban planning, especially in Zadar by Bruno Milić and his followers. Novel approach was affirmed by art historian, university professor, and Karaman's successor in the Conservation Institute of Zagreb, Milan Prelog. On the occasion of National Conference in Split in 1953, he claimed that the healing of severe wounds imposed a need for revisions of some dogmatic postulates arising from the strict conservation principles. Prelog's commitment coincided with Renato Bonelli's call for revision of the theory of architectural restoration from the same year. Prelog promoted historical, topographical, and holistic approach to historic towns. As dynamic of urbanization intensified during the 1950s, conservators became more active in protection of old towns. While in the first post-war years, they issued ordinances on preservation of individual objects within old settings, Prelog suggested socially relevant urban rehabilitation. He was soon followed by Jerko and Tomislav Marasovic in the city core of Split. Since the early 1950s, Prelog was engaged in urban rehabilitation and reconstruction of the bombarded Istrian city of Krejčí. In 1957, he wrote, "Reconstruction will be both justified and necessary for one of the most important monuments in this city, for its urban system." Prelog's contribution to urban historical studies as a constituent part of expansion of socialist city was invaluable. In those years, Yugoslavia experienced economic and urban growth, with the rise of industry and tourism, which led to transformation of urban landscapes. As in Italy, skyscrapers appeared in historic cores of Zagreb, Rijeka, Špikić, Split. Urban centers expanded territorially and demographically, but in most cases, development was restrained on the limits of historic quarters. Since their first contacts with Heimatschutz movement, Croatian conservators were aware of the values of urban and rural ensembles in their natural context. Facing post-Second World War urban growth and war damages, they collaborated or polemicized with modernist urban planners and architects. This attracted the attention of Italian experts, so they participated at the 1957 Milan Triennale conference on urbanist actuality of monuments and old settings, presenting diverse results: urban conservation in Istria and Kvarnero by Zdenko Sila, urban rehabilitation of Split by Tomislav Marasovic, and new urban planning in Zadar by Bruno Milic. It is worth mentioning that after the plans for demolitions in theretofore depreciated lower town of historicist Zagreb, conservators at the beginning of the 1960s registered the whole urban area. So during the 1950s, Yugoslav society was liberalized and modernized. Croatian conservators established their association, reaching for public support in newspapers and specialized journals. Traditional Austrian and German principles of care of monuments were supplemented by post-war Italian and especially Polish models. On 30th of April 1960, the second law on protection of cultural monuments was passed, emphasizing the value of monuments in fulfilling the cultural needs of social community. The system was thus consolidated as important institutional achievement in a transforming society, becoming a legacy in itself. Thank you.
Děkuji panu kolegovi za velmi podnětný referát, který...
Thank you for a very interesting talk, for a very interesting presentation, which shows some common points and some differences comparing to the Czech situation. I will ask you to stop sharing your presentation now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Liliana Iuga, who is concentrating on history of towns and cities, and she studied on the Central European University in Budapest. Her dissertation was entitled Reshaping the Historic City Under Socialism, State Preservation, Urban Planning and the Politics of Scarcity in Romania, 1945 to 1977. She studied also history and art history in Cluj and Perugia in Italy, and was a visiting fellow at the Center for Urban History at the University of Leicester. Her research interests are located at the intersection between the history of architecture, urban planning, heritage preservation, and nationalism during the 20th century. Today's presentation is entitled Old Monuments in a New Regime, Conceptualizing Architectural Heritage in 1950s Romania. Dear colleague, you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, the organizers, for bringing us together and giving us the chance to have this comparative view on heritage policies after 1945. I will share my presentation now. Just 1 second. So in this presentation, I will talk about the reorganization of monument protection in 1950s Romania, trying to show how heritage specialists attempted to revive this activity despite a difficult political and ideological context, and even manipulated it in order to support their own agenda. The most important achievement was undertaking the first inventory of historic monuments in Romania and creating legislation in the field, which was promulgated in 1955. The picture I'm showing here is from the 1990s, but it's pretty much symbolical for what happened during the 1950s as well. And you will see this castle a bit later in another slide. So actually the 1950s were marked by two complementary processes. First, an attempt to reconceptualize heritage in the post-war context, given both the changes in property regimes and the ideological requirements of the communists, and second, the efforts to institutionalize monument protection as part of state-building processes. The 1950s were a difficult period for all the countries of the Eastern Bloc that had to recover from the devastating effects of the war, but were also going through harsh political repression. From an economic point of view, it was a period characterized by austerity. Resources were extracted from the population to be directed towards either paying the war debt to the Soviet Union, in the Romanian case, or to be directed toward the development of industry, of heavy industry. The coming to power of the communists brought significant changes in property regimes. Many historical buildings, such as palaces and castles, were confiscated from their former owners and either abandoned or destroyed by the local population or given a more practical usage in line with the needs of the regime. The ideological shift and the need to comply with the Soviet model led to many ruptures and disruptions in all fields. The story of the Commission for Historic Monuments in socialist Romania had a rather unpromising start. In 1948, it was overlooked in the process of institutional reorganization. It was simply ignored that such an institution should even exist. Its collection of books, photographs, and the archive were either split between various institutions or stored in basements where it was damaged or lost. Still, in the following years, the activity was reorganized, also based on the argument that all the neighboring countries, part of the Eastern Bloc, had institutions for monument protection, and that the Soviet Union had promulgated new legislation in the field in 1948. Unlike the neighboring countries, however, the Romanian state had weak traditions in the field of monument protection. There were also considerable differences between the regions that became part of Romania. In the Old Kingdom, so Moldavia and Wallachia, the activity of the Commission for Historic Monuments had focused mostly on medieval churches. On the other hand, Transylvania and Bukovina, which had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had much stronger traditions and employed specialists that had been trained in Vienna and Budapest. Another aspect to be considered was the major differences in the understanding of heritage between experts and local communities. For the population at large, heritage was understood as something non-material, what we call intangible heritage, while experts privileged a Western understanding of the term, trying to protect the monuments of the nation. Not least, the focus was on religious rather than civil architecture, because such buildings used to be in private property. So, in the early 1950s, the activity in the field of monument protection was reorganized in several institutions whose activity was interconnected. Following the Soviet model, there was a scientific commission, which was part of the Romanian Academy. It included historians, art historians, archaeologists, and architects who discussed theoretical problems, so to say. Then there was a committee for historic monuments. We did the State Committee for Architecture and Construction. It consisted of architects and had a consultative role. In addition, there was also a workshop specialized in monument restoration. Following the interwar approach, the churches remained the main beneficiaries of restoration projects, at least in the 1950s. The most important decisions were, however, taken by a small number of experts who are part of both commissions. And I have here the picture of architect Grigore Ionescu, who was one of the main actors and main responsible, let's say, for the reorganization of this activity. The activity of these commissions was frustrated by many practical problems, and I'm mostly interested in this sort of struggles. In this decade, the definition of the historic monument was still a traditional one. There was skepticism towards including even late 19th century architecture, even houses with a memorial value. The beneficiaries, so the institutions that came to occupy a lot of buildings, a lot of old buildings, were skeptical towards the idea of restoration. The belief that buildings in an advanced state of disrepair should be simply demolished seemed dominant. There were requests from the institutions using those buildings to have them demolished. Even the 18th century, for example, so even the 18th century Habsburg citadel in Timișoara. There was then the question of who is financing restoration, because the Committee for Historic Monuments had a small budget just for urgent interventions, while institutions and even local councils seemed unwilling to pay for restorations. And here in the pictures, you have the castle that I showed in the first slide. So that was an intermediary stage. You have the picture how it used to look like and how it looks like now after some restoration work has been done. So how to redefine the concept of historic monuments in the new political context? It was a question for the scientific commission, how to appropriate all the buildings that were ideologically unacceptable, such as churches and palaces. Following the conceptualization used in the Soviet Union, monuments were defined as material embodiments of culture. There was a shift from historicity to materiality that also reflected the need to incorporate the recent history, that of the Communist Party. The new definition moved the focus from individual to collective actors, from the beneficiary to the producer, allowing for the appropriation of traditional forms of built heritage, such as churches, palaces, and castles. In other words, it was no longer important who had owned and used certain objects, but rather who had created them. For example, churches could be deprived of religious connotation, yet still be retained as valuable monuments. as their authorship would be attributed to the broadly defined professional category of popular masters or craftsmen. As a result of the nationalization of the property, as it was called, heritage objects had been transferred from private into socialist property, thus becoming goods belonging to the entire people. Besides the production of meaning, the Scientific Commission was also entrusted with the task of recording heritage objects. No comprehensive unitary inventory had existed in Romania previously. Those surveys had been made at regional level. In the territories that had belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, inventories had already been completed even before the First World War and were still in use during the interwar period. So the nation-level inventory was coordinated by the Scientific Commission, and it was undertaken in 1953. The rhetoric justifying the necessity of such an endeavor reproduced Soviet heritage discourses, emphasizing both the universalist ethos. In this sense, monuments were defined as the material evidence reflecting the development of human society, and socialist patriotism. Conveniently, it was argued that the socialist state would offer a better framework for monument protection as compared to the bourgeois regime, due to the stronger character of the centralized state, owning more mechanisms to control and coordinate policy making at different administrative levels. Far from glorifying the socialist state, I argue these statements actually reflect the preservationist strategy of appropriating elements of the official rhetoric in order to serve their own agenda. As I said before, the context was favorable, since the Soviet Union had passed legislation in the field in 1948. So the forms for every monument proposed for to be classified, including the name, category, comprehensive description, also information regarding use and maintenance. There were 5 categories that you have listed here: architectural, archaeological, historic, artistic, and historic, regarding the activity of the Romanian Communist Party. The inventory was conducted at the local level between May and June 1953. As the last stage of the process, the list compiled at local level was centralized in Bucharest, where the organizing committee selected the monuments that would be listed. The main criterion that informed the preservationist choice was not so much the perceived historical or aesthetic importance of the proposals as the quality of the documentation provided. In other words, the better prepared the local committee, the higher the chance for their work to be validated by Bucharest-based experts. As a result, this strategy privileged those areas which already enjoyed a strong tradition and interest in local history. Given the short period left for documentation, so a couple of months, it would have been impossible to start a research from scratch. One had to be already equipped with a bibliography in order to assemble an adequate description. The ideological argument was invoked as to justify the appeal to local expertise. For the first time, such lists were compiled by calling the support of the locals and the popular masses. Later analysis, however, emphasized numerous shortcomings in the entire process. Bucharest-based experts complained that the inventory had largely been the work of school teachers, thus of people with no particular expertise in the heritage field. The field-in forms were full of mistakes or blank spaces, which demonstrated lack of familiarity with basic notions of art history. For example, a report mentioned the Gothic Byzantine style or Franconian in reference to buildings which actually belonged to Baroque. It took 1 year until the final list was put together, during which the Commission met in weekly sessions to review about 13,000 proposals. Only 1/3 of the total number were considered back up by solid documentation. So the final list contained 4,360 monument of culture. The largest share was represented by architectural monument. In addition, the items were divided into two categories, national or according to their relevance, so national or local. The committee felt compelled to work under constant time pressure, confident that transforming the list into a law was essential in order to ensure a legal basis for enforcing the task of monument protection upon the people's councils, so the local authorities. Otherwise, the preservationists considered that the list had only a provisional character, which would be updated to the extent to which more proposed monuments would be adequately documented. In the end, 3 legal documents were elaborated and promulgated as legislation: a decision regarding the preservation and use of monuments of culture, the statute of the Commission, and a list of monuments of culture. As one architect emphasized, an additional motivation for the relatively small number of items to be included on the official list was that a higher number could have been considered an excessive burden for the government. Given the austerity of the 1950s, it was fair to admit that the available resources had to be directed towards the protection of the most representative examples. Expert debates regarding the establishment of heritage value hierarchies turned particularly tense, being sometimes accompanied by a sense of emergency and even despair. Even despair because from the local level, there were always letters coming emphasizing more destruction, actually. Another architect, Stefan Balch, claimed that given the very limited funding available, the focus should be on those monuments which are unique in the world, such as these Bukovina monasteries that we have here from the 15th century. In contrast, Horea Teodoru, himself an architect, considered classification as a discriminatory practice as it indirectly condemned large number of monuments to total neglect. The promulgation of new legislation was perceived as an essential step for enforcing institutional responsibility for monument protection. While all monuments of culture were placed under state protection, the People's Council and private owners were made responsible for their safeguarding, preservation, and restoration. The inventory reflected regional differences in the perception of what constitutes a historic monument. Despite its large surface and share of population, Bucharest had over 1 million inhabitants. The list for Bucharest included as little as 126 architectural monuments. Now it has about 2,500 or something. In comparison, the city of Cluj in Transylvania had 172. Most of which were situated within the area of the former medieval fortifications. This implied a house-by-house listing of entire streets in the city center, showing a clear geographical definition of what constituted the historic center. In the case of Iași, former capital of Moldavia in eastern Romania, the list included almost an equal number of churches and monasteries and major examples of civil architecture, such as former aristocratic residences, in total 68 buildings. One town, Sighișoara, which you have here in the picture, which had preserved its medieval walls, was listed as a unit, as a medieval citadel. A report from 1955 recorded numerous instances of neglect and destruction, demonstrating the lack of impact of the recently promulgated law for monuments protection on the activity of people's councils. Local administrations continue to allocate few financial resources for restoration, favoring monuments of exceptional importance. Even when approved, restoration works would constantly be postponed, and other problems seem more urgent. In many cases, municipalities refused altogether to take any responsibility for monument protection and restoration, leaving historic buildings to degradation and ruin. On the back of a paper recording the minutes of one meeting in November 1956, one member of the commission wrote, "Nothing has been achieved, although I have reached an agreement with the others. The activity of the Orthodox Patriarchate, the People's Council shows no respect. Is 661, so this is the decision of the Council of Ministers, good? 1 year, a phantom commission." In parallel, efforts to organize a unitary commission with more political support were undermined by internal conflicts between various areas of expertise. There were architects on one hand, historians, art historians, archaeologists on the other. Architects claimed more influence, yet the field of historic monuments could not be reduced to architecture alone. Still, what remained in place after 1959 was just the Department for Historic Monuments within the State Committee for Architecture. So this presentation has shown that heritage policies in 1950s Romania were marked by important institutional and conceptual continuities with the previous period, as well by new challenges brought by the post-war political context. The scale of neglect and destruction caused by nationalization of property forced professionals to leave their ivory tower and face the realities on the ground. However, the efforts to reorganize the heritage field within the new state-building framework were frustrated by institutional divisions, conflicts between professionals and areas of expertise, austerity, as well as lack of awareness from the part of the local administration population at large. Overall, the impact of heritage policies in 1950s Romania remained questionable. The connection with the people, so much emphasized in the propagandistic texts, was promoted out of necessity rather than choice, while the specialists rely on their expertise and political connections in the struggle for protecting heritage objects from the masses that had theoretically produced them, and the local administrations that were supposed to ensure their safeguarding. So also, in order not to finish in such a negative note, I added this picture that is from the tower of the Gothic church, one of the Gothic churches in Cluj. And this church was restored in 1950s. In the tower, which is usually closed for visitors, we discovered a small sanctuary dedicated to the restoration from the 1950s. So there were also a lot of restoration work. I didn't want to talk about that. I rather wanted to focus on the struggles there were also a big part of the activity of the preservationists in the 1950s. Thank you.
Velice děkuji paní kolegyni. Její příspěvek byl...
Thank you very much for this remarkable presentation. It's interesting to see that also in Romania, the experts had to adopt a language that was accepted by the power, by the political powers. That's something we know from the Czech environment as well. And maybe it's something we can talk about at the end of the session during the Q&A. Our next presentation is about the state heritage administration in 1953 by Kristina Uhlíková, who is one of the active organizers of the conference. Kristina Uhlíková works at the Academy of Science of the Czech Republic. She studied art history and archival studies at the Faculty of Arts in Olomouc, and she very efficiently combines these two specializations in her publications, which has a great impact on the quality of reflecting on the history of heritage care. She focuses on the history of heritage care and on the historiography of art history, as well as on research, Czech cultural history of the second half of the 19th and the 20th centuries. She also focuses on making historical scientific texts accessible. Dear colleague, the floor is yours. Please switch on your microphone.
Vážená paní kolegyně, máte vypnutý mikrofon.
Your microphone is off.
Omlouvám se za technické komplikace.
I apologize for these technical complications. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to share my presentation about an institution that was very important in the history of Czech heritage care in the 1950s. The institution was called State Heritage Administration. I hope you can see my presentation. During the 5 years of its existence, the State Heritage Administration made a relatively significant mark in the history of Czech monument conservation, as it was the first institution that not only supervised professionally, but also directly managed, or at least participated in the management of most of the country's most valuable, immovable and public movable monuments. First of all, I'd like to speak about the context of the establishment of this big institution. The role of the State Heritage Administration in the interwar times, in spite of the strong tradition, was mainly interventionist, professional, advisory, and direct state financial subsidies for the reconstruction of monuments were minimal. According to most of the experts involved, the position of monument care in the state administration was inferior, and the majority of the public, as well as state officials, did not consider financial or legislative support of this sphere to be very justified. The law on monument care was not even adopted at that time. The entire bureaucratic apparatus consisted of less than 20 employees, including purely administrative staff. The end of the Second World War brought, as in most areas of life, a key turning point. The scope of the tasks that the State Conservation Service had to continue to deal with changed radically, even though Czechoslovakia had a minimum of direct war damage to monuments compared to other European countries. The approach of state officials to heritage care also changed. In several waves of expropriation of private property between 1945 and 1950, the state gradually became the owner, or at least a temporary owner, of most immovable and movable monuments. The expropriation in Czechoslovakia, according to Professor Uhlík, was the most massive from all Central European countries of the Eastern Bloc. As state support for cultural heritage was in the electoral program of all the political parties, not excluding the victorious Communist Party, it was impossible not to pay attention to these monuments. After the communist coup in February 1948, for the first time in Czechoslovak history, the proclamation that cultural assets are under the protection of the state shall ensure that they are accessible to all, was incorporated into the constitution, the so-called Constitution of 9th May. I'm sorry, I can't move forward with my slides.
Ne, že by ta prezentace byla. Já ji zkusím otevřít znova, omlouvám se.
I'm sorry, I will try to open the presentation again.
Vidíte ji, ne? Ano?
Vidíme pořád ten první slide teď. Ano.
Yes, now we can see the second slide. I apologize for this. So the first institution to take over the administration and responsibility for the adequate protection and cultural use of at least some of the state-appropriated monuments was the National Cultural Commission, which began its activities in early 1947. It's the then President Edvard Beneš who initiated the establishment of the commission, and it was presided by art historian, the biggest figure of monument care during the First Republic, Zdeněk Wirth, who is in the picture in the middle of the group. Its 5 years of existence, which were of equal length with the State Monuments Administration, focused particularly on the nationalized noble residences and their furnishings. Act number 137, which established the Commission, also introduced the very important and unusually generous status of the so-called state cultural property, which could be assigned to immovable and movable objects of cultural value selected by representatives of the Commission and its successors. This was really an unprecedented remit or power, unprecedented in the history of Czechoslovak monument care. The administration of this property, the basis of which was 100 noble residences, belonged to the Natural Culture Commission and later to its successors, including the State Heritage Administration. In addition to the National Cultural Commission, there was also the State Monuments Office, which focused on the remaining monuments, that is, outside the so-called state cultural property. And there was also the State Institute of Photography and Geodesy, which focused on the documentation of monuments. Coordination of the whole field was the responsibility of the Education Department of the Ministry of Education, just like under the First Republic, which also managed the nature conservation agenda. This system was reorganized at the end of 1951 in connection with the decentralization of the state administration. Most of the administration of the aforementioned state cultural property was handed over to the regional administrative offices of the regional national committees, while national coordination was transferred to the relevant department of the Ministry of Education and Science, and most of the staff of the National Cultural Commission, which had been abolished, was transferred there. The State Heritage Administration was transformed into the State Heritage Institute with a branch in Brno and the Slovak State Heritage Institute in Bratislava, which were to become purely professional institutions. However, it soon became apparent that the regional national committees were mostly unable to adequately ensure its new responsibilities in this field. In March 1943, the government therefore decided that the dysfunctional system of monument care needed to be reorganized again. The Ministry of Education and Enlightenment decided to resolve the situation provisionally, pending the approval of a monuments law, with a definitive concept of the system, which was not yet clear, by merging all the central institutions mentioned above, that is, the 7th Department of the former Ministry of Education, the State Heritage Institute, and the State Photography Institute into a single institution called the State Heritage Administration. As of 13th of July 1953, a large central body with extensive executive powers and professional competencies was created, not only in the field of monument conservation, but also in the field of nature protection. This concept was considered by most of the experts involved to be a practically optimal solution for the realization of their visions, which had not been realizable in the pre-war period. In any case, it was a complete novelty in the existing practice of Czech conservation. Now, organizations and people. Archivist Miroslav Burian, a high official of the Ministry of Education, was appointed to head this institution. He was imprisoned during the war, and Jaroslav Stránsky, a natural scientist, became his deputy. In 1958, in this building, which was the seat of the administration, this is situated in Hybernská Street 3, the so-called Svertspork Palace, in the center of Prague. It had 165 employees, and the building became too small. It was no longer sufficient for the office. The internal scientific council of this new institution consisted of a series of important personalities of heritage care and of Czech art history. You can see them here. Art historians Oldřich Jakub Blažíček, Viktor Kotr, Václav Mencel, Jakub Pavel, Oliva Pechová, restorator František Petr, architect Josef Šibek, and art historian Vlastimil Vintr. The structure of this new institution consisted of 2 departments, an administrative one and an expert one. Each department had on average 9 experts. The first department focused on general preservation of monuments, that is to say, the monuments outside of the state cultural property. And this department was headed by historian Jakub Pavel. The second department focused on research and documentation on monuments. The third one was responsible for cultural and educational use of monuments, mainly those castles and chateaus, making them accessible to the public, but also the approval of export of monuments abroad. This important department was headed by the prominent art historian Oldřich Jakub Blažíček. The fourth department was responsible for architecture and monuments, that is the methodical management of immovable monuments. The head of the department was first the famous architect Josef Pošmorný, who was then succeeded by Josef Šebek, architect as well. In this department this department had prominent preservationists, architects, Václav Mencel, Řetislav Štorm, Viktor Kotrba. This department cooperated with a specialized institution focused on the design preparation of monuments, established in 1954, the so-called State Institute for the Reconstruction of Protected Towns and Buildings, abbreviated as SURPMO, mentioned yesterday many times. It was headed by architect Wilhelm Lorenz. The institute was established as part of a new system of centrally managed, restructured construction industry. The fifth department focused on the restoration of monuments. It was headed by restorer František Petr and later by Vlastimil Vintr. The sixth department was less important, and it was responsible for state protection of nature and landscape. We can say that the state heritage administration, in terms of personnel, has relatively significantly built on the pre-1945 heritage care. It is therefore understandable that the professional continuity with the previous period was also significant. There were several prominent personalities who were forced to leave other, especially pedagogical positions for ideological reasons, like the aforementioned Blažíček, Mencel, or their work in other areas could be problematic for ideological reasons, which was the case of the architect and Catholic-oriented writer Řetislav Štorm. But he was not the only one. Next chapter, Categorization of Monuments. The unprecedented increase in the number of monuments for which the state and the state monument care was to be directly responsible and fully or at least selectively finance their maintenance must necessarily have led to the establishment of priorities. The monuments were divided into several categories. This categorization was first officially announced in a government resolution from July 1950. Gradually, it was further refined, especially by the State Heritage Administration. The main categories were usually subdivided into further subcategories. The order of the categories and subcategories reflected the degree of importance. What emerged was a relatively fixed system with a precise hierarchy of importance of these groups for the new society, underpinned by Marxist-Leninist ideology. It was created under external pressure from state and administration leaders and was ideologically conditioned. However, it only partially reflected the actual view of the majority of professional workers on the significance of a given group of monuments. At the time of the State Heritage Administration, the system consisted of the following categories of monuments in the following order. Number 1, monuments to the origins and development of the labor movement and socialism in our country and to the most important personalities associated with the progressive traditions of the Czechoslovak people. That's a quote. Number 2, urban conservation areas. Number 3, state castles and chateaus. Number 4, monuments of folk architecture. Number 5, the so-called scattered monuments, which mostly included religious or cult monuments. Funding. The operation and activities of the State Heritage Administration were, of course, fully financed by the state on the basis of various legislative measures. The administration was obliged to ensure the direct administration and protection of a large group of state castles and chateaus, as well as to ensure, with its own means, the protection and reconstruction in urban conservation reserves, gradually emerging reserves of folk architecture, and the so-called Category 2 castles and chateaus. Interventions in favor of other monuments were financed only selectively. In 1951, according to my calculations, this represented about 0.24 thousandths of state expenditure and 0.20 in 1952. And this share remains more or less the same. Compared to the pre-war situation, this was a diametric increase, about 50 times or 100 times more. The ratio between expenditure on the reconstruction of monuments and on the operation of the administration and the management of buildings, especially state castles, was approximately 2-to-1 in favor of reconstruction. Nevertheless, it was unrealistic to expect this expenditure to be sufficient to adequately provide for the tasks mentioned, even if the situation were not complicated by the cumbersome system of centrally managed state economy. This idealistic concept was maybe the biggest problem or obstacle that led to the disastrous state of the monuments at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s. Let me now mention the most important categories. The first category was the monuments remembering the beginnings and development of the labor movement and socialism. Here we can see the birth house of President Klement Gottwald in Tikinice that was adapted and made accessible in these times. The protection and often the direct administration of these monuments was not managed only by the administration, Heritage Administration, but also by the so-called Ideological Council for the Care of Monuments, Memorials and Memorial Plaques, which was established as a body of the Ministry of Culture. And it included representatives of the ministry, museums, and above all, the Institute of the History of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The Ideological Council created the order in which the monuments were to be renovated and made accessible to the public. The second category of monuments were the urban conservation areas. During the existence of the State Heritage Administration, these were presented as a showcase of the success of socialist monument care, but also of the socialist system in general, which promoted culture to such an unprecedented degree compared to the capitalist system. The post-war situation of the border towns, formerly inhabited mainly by forcibly evicted German residents, became increasingly alarming in the late 1940s. Certainly also in view of the fact that the promotion of the borderlands was one of the state's priorities. In 1950, the government declared 30 cores of the most historically significant towns as so-called urban conservation areas or reserves. And this selection no longer included only border towns. Here, extensive gradual reconstruction financed by the state was envisaged. A special amount was devoted to it. In the first years after the reserves were declared, the whole initiative produced very clearly visible positive results. However, it became increasingly clear to most of those involved that it was unrealistic to undertake such a large-scale and, above all, expensive project, especially in a very cumbersome system of state-run economy. However, this was never officially acknowledged. And we will learn in the following presentation about the consequences of this from Dr. Krejčí. State castles and chateaus. From more than 1,000 historical noble mansions in Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, expropriated from their original, particularly noble owners, the State Heritage Administration selected more than 150 of the most valuable ones, mostly with extensive surrounding park areas, eventually covering a total area of 30 square kilometers. The most valuable furnishings from the remaining expropriated aristocratic mansions, as well as other expropriated buildings, were gradually concentrated in the premises of those buildings. In 1954, it had a total of 419,904 inventory numbers of objects and 1,270,000 volumes of books. This entire convolute, including real estate, constituted the so-called state cultural property and was directly managed by the State Heritage Administration. State castles and chateaus were gradually opened to the public, while the form of access was specified and arguments were thought through to justify the presentation of former property of a, I quote, hostile social group, that is, the nobleman or aristocracy. The worldwide development of tourism in the Soviet bloc countries associated with the central organization of workers' leisure time, and undoubtedly also the limited possibilities of traveling abroad, soon elevated the state castles and chateaus to the position of the main tourist destinations of Czechoslovakia. In 1953, state castles and chateaus were visited by about 1.2 million visitors. In 1956, it was already 3.3 million of visitors, and the number continued to grow. Conclusion. Since its establishment, the State Heritage Administration was regarded as a temporary solution to the crisis situation until the forthcoming Heritage Act is passed. However, contrary to expectations, this provisional period extended until 1958. In the end, the concept of combining the professional and executive branches in one large central office, favored by most experts, failed to make it into the new law from 1958. And from that year onwards, the two spheres of heritage protection remained permanently separated in Czechoslovakia and later in Czech Republic as well. In the last few years of its existence, the State Heritage Administration was increasingly criticized by external experts, both from the Cabinet of Theory and Art History and from architects, because they felt it did not follow scientific trends sufficiently and did not devote itself sufficiently to the professional side of conservation. On the other hand, the Ministry of State Control accused it of inconsistent compliance with decrees and government regulations, while the scale of its agenda, the amount of funding allocated, and a number of other external complications were not taken into account. In addition, it was under constant ideological pressure that forced it to repeatedly defend the meaningfulness of historical monuments for the new society, even though the communist state leadership, on the other hand, used its achievements to legitimize the political regime. These external pressures greatly undermined its activities and ultimately led to its demise. The State Heritage Administration thus remained a mere episode in the history of Czech monument care. Thank you very much for your attention. I used the visuals from the publications of the State Heritage Administration. This is a coat of arms that was on one of the publications on the castles and chateaus. So there's no intention of nationalism, it's just to show the visuals from the 1950s. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you for a very interesting contribution to the extremely large subject of the monument preservation in 1950s. A story going on and on between the centralization and decentralization of the preservation care, which is a subject that we can touch upon in the discussion. I will kindly ask you, dear colleague, to stop the sharing of your presentation.
Děkuji. A poslední přednáškou dnešního bloku druhé sekce.
The last contribution of this section of the conference will be the talk by Marek Krejčí, who is a historian of art. He studied on Masaryk University in Brno and on Charles University in Prague. His dissertation concentrated on modern history and monuments preservation in Central and Eastern Europe. He worked in Poland and he is now affiliated to the Center for Slavic Artistic Studies. His talk for today is entitled The Golden Sixties, Critical Remarks on Heritage Practices of the Act on Cultural Heritage Properties. The floor is yours, dear colleague. Thank you. I will start with the day of 3rd of May, 1958, when the Monuments Act came into force, many preservationists optimistically considered the day as the fulfillment of their long-standing aspirations and the beginning of a new golden age of Czech monuments. In the correspondence of academician Wirth, we can read a laconic description of the meeting of the National Assembly. I quote, "The rapporteur was Deputy Šafari from Žehušice, discussed in 20 minutes, approved unanimously. The purely formal manner of the discussion in the Assembly seemed to indicate that matters were and would be decided elsewhere." Jaroslav Helfert, the grandson of the former president of the Central Commission for Monument Preservation, was one of the few to take a skeptical attitude to the law, resigning his post as district preservationist or district conservator in the Rychnov region after its adoption, saying that he could hear the death bell ringing for monument preservation and then that he himself did not want to be a mortician during its funeral. Although the law enshrined the activities of the existing volunteer preservation workers, in practice, the national committees often did not invite them to commission meetings or communicate their results to them. Despite this, in 1963, he was still involved in opposing the removal of the ruins of the Baroque pilgrimage church in Neratov, which therefore could be restored later after 1989. In the case of another church, St. Nicholas Church in Přísečnice, another preservationist tried in vain to involve the Historical Institute of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences in its preservation because it contained the grave of an important humanist writer, Bohuslav Hasištejnský of Lobkovice. In the end, the tombstone was transferred to the collections of the Chomutov Museum and the church was demolished. The Monument Preservation Authority service did not seek to derive the legitimacy of the public interest in the protection of monuments from a broader society-wide consensus, but relied entirely on a system of authoritative commands and prohibitions in the law. It did not realize that it would continue to become dependent on how and by whom this interest formally recognized by law would be interpreted and enforced. Particularly in the Stalinist period, it was heavily subordinated to political and economic interests. A number of heritage buildings were assigned to uses completely inappropriate to their value. For instance, the Empire Castle in Kostelec nad Orlicí housed a research institute for pig breeding. The North Bohemian Brown Coal Mines mining company argued that the contribution of 1 million tons of coal per year to the national economy from the newly opened large-scale Pokrok mine was more than sufficient to offset the value of the demolished monument, the Baroque hospital with the Rainer fresco in Duchcov. This fresco finally was taken out and put into a museum. The Monument Preservation Authority has not been able to break out of this imposed hierarchy of values. And what is worse, many of its representatives identified with it and even tried to develop theoretical theses about the dialectical relations between the values of monuments of the past and the needs of the new socialist society. These servile interpretations of Marxist-Leninist theory took on an unexpected synergistic effect in the context of the provision of the Cultural Monuments Act that allows for proceedings for the waiver of monument protection for exceptionally serious reasons. The authors of this law hardly anticipated how often this provision would be invoked by national committees, economic organizations, and other administrators of state cultural property. In 1962, the Ministry of Education and Culture laid down the procedure by an internal instruction where the possibilities of a new functional use of the building and the economic aspect of the reconstruction were to be considered equally alongside the actual monumental value. The deletion of the intended heritage fund from the draft outline of the law meant that the heritage authorities themselves were unable to contribute effectively to the increased costs associated with the maintenance or restoration of the monuments. And if the owner or manager did not show any interest in fulfilling the statutory obligation to maintain the cultural monument in good condition, they mostly just tolerated the progressing process of destruction. The categorization of monuments, which was supposed to be related to the selection of the most valuable objects to be included in the plans for monument restoration, gradually turned into a supporting reason for the depreciation of surplus monuments of categories 4 and 3. The archival material contains numerous documents on interventions demanding the destruction of monuments sent to the Ministry of Education and Culture. For instance, there was a request for the demolition of the church in Hustopeče, and in November 1961, the ministry instructed the deputy minister to ensure the revoke the monument status from the building and to demolish it subsequently. Also, there was a request to demolish 3 timbered houses on the square in Lomnice nad Popelkou. Here, the preservation officers proposed a compromise, which consisted in dismantling the wooden folk architecture and reassembling it on another site. However, without informing anyone, the Municipal National Committee itself began to carry out the unprofessional dismantling of the houses by temporary workers in unsuitable rainy weather, so that after a year and a half of negotiations, just before Christmas 1961, consent had been given to abandon the monument protection of no longer existing building, which was left with a pile of rotten beams inappropriately placed. This case also illustrates the errors of compromises that devalued the very essence of state monuments preservation. In another case, the National Committee resisted investing in the repair of a local church as a liturgical site. The preservation authorities agreed to demolish the church nave with the provision that at least the old Gothic tower would be preserved and repaired. This torso of the original building without any function or meaning was finally demolished 5 years later. It was precisely in the case of church monuments that the drive of militant atheism to liquidate this cultural heritage was strongly manifested, although it did not gain the momentum of the Soviet Union. There, under Khrushchev, there was a new wave of persecution of the church, symbolized by the demolition of one of the cathedrals in Moscow. Resistance was aroused by the efforts to reconstruct the towers of Cheb's city's main church, the St. Nicholas Church, which the towers were destroyed at the end of the war during the aerial bombing of 20th of April 1945. The friendly relations of architect Poshmony with the administrator of Cheb parish led to suspicions that they were boycotting the government's policy of dealing with religious questions and promoting scientific atheism. According to his recollections, he stated that the church towers were part of a triangulation network, and later he had to use a more understandable argument that in the pictures of a national artist, Josef Lada, the church tower was always painted as a natural dominating feature of the town. Nevertheless, the reconstruction of the towers did not take place until 2008. In 1961, the monument protection of Santini's Baroque Central Chapel in Hostachov in the Havlíčkův region was abandoned because of the disproportionate cost of any repairs. The fate of the monument was co-determined by district and regional church secretaries overseeing church affairs, who interpreted popular piety as an example of class war. Olga Preissnerová recalled how surprised she was that one of them even published an article in the press for the monuments. In a weak moment, however, he exposed his hypocrisy with a boastful account of how he had ordered a tractor to tear down a divine torment. Confrontation of a historic monument with a plan for new construction usually ended with the project plan being pushed through, and it is noteworthy that both the investor and the designer usually insisted on the built-up plots in the historic core of the city. The well-known case of the Prayer department store in the middle of the Uhlíková square has its precursor in the construction of the Perla department store on a merged plot of land after 3 municipal houses and Empire Meat Shop in the center of Pelhřimov. The monument protection of the buildings here was abandoned in November 1962, despite the tenacious opposition of the regional center. The institute also issued a negative opinion on the removal of part of the medieval fortifications on an adjacent ground floor houses of the Jewish ghetto in Prostějov. At the European Forum, Czechoslovak preservationists boasted with the urban conservation reserves as an innovative approach to the comprehensive conservation of historic urban areas. The first reserve towns were declared by government resolution in 1950. Despite efforts to plan for the necessary monument maintenance, especially in the border region with its strong migration processes, the condition of the monument stock in the reserves deteriorated. In Horní Slavkov, the former center of tin and metal mining in Slavkov Forest, a number of Renaissance townhouses were either demolished or in a very poor condition. Václav Mencel, one of the initiators of the creation of urban reserves, bitterly admitted that the buildings would need a roofer in some instances more than an approved concept. The second controversial reserve was Cheb, where the decay of wooden elements of the half-timbered houses continued very rapidly due to insufficient provision and maintenance. According to a government resolution, the border town was to be restored by 1960 by earmarking funds. However, the construction company Pozemní stavby in Karlovy Vary, which was supposed to ensure the reconstruction, moved only part of the planned staff and capacities here under various pretexts. The State Heritage Administration, as the general investor, had to find other construction companies in other regions, temporary workers and private builders. In an effort to revoke the government's resolution to move part of the regional authorities to the remote town of Cheb, representatives of the Regional National Committee invited Karol Bacílek, a member of the political bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, who was close to the Prime Minister Vilja Široký. They informed him of their objections to the reconstruction of Cheb, where the state budget was supposedly being used wastefully. The government commissioner, architect Pošmůrný, had to face the criticism that he preferred reconstruction with a high proportion of specialized professional work, even in the case of buildings that completed the environment of the conservation area, while from the point of view of costs, it would be seemingly more advantageous to demolish them and build them anew using mechanization and typification. In an attempt to discredit the reconstruction, an article was published in the Central Party newspaper Rudé Právo, accusing the State Heritage Administration of encouraging the involvement of a private construction company in the reconstruction work in Cheb. The government at that time had just, by a resolution of 25th of May 1957, instructed all ministers to make measures with their ministerial competence to implement the political line to curb and suppress the last private business elements as remnants of the exploiting classes. The campaign resulted in the exemplary condemnation of the architect Pošmůrný and architect Oldřich Stefan, then slowing down of the generously conceived action and the transfer of the task of investors to the state company in Karlovy Vary. The latter carried out further work without due consideration of the monument values. Thus, Renaissance house with Gothic elements in Úzká Street was repaired in such a way that in spring the roof was removed, the main cornice and the masonry to the upper quarter of the second floor windows were demolished, and at this stage the construction was stopped for half a year. Then the general investor applied for demolition, and before the end of the year further conservation work was abandoned. It became apparent that the original 1960 deadline for completion of the HEP redevelopment would not be met. The issue was discussed at the 127th meeting of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia on 20th of December 1960. On the basis of conclusions, in the following years, a decision was issued to abandon the conservation of hundreds of historic houses, stating in the justification that the reconstruction would be economically unjustifiable and would not outweigh the historical value gained. In several cases, the buildings were demolished before the actual waiver of conservation was granted. Paradoxically, in line with the principle of cost effectiveness, the demolition of buildings for which funds had already been spent in previous years was also carried out. In the case of the medieval suburban church of St. Jost, which was repaired after the war, the north wall of the presbytery was demolished in June 1964 using a strong rope pulled by a wheeled tractor, on the grounds that the dilapidated church was attracting unwanted interest from foreign tourists who were photographing it. In the 1960s, the Communist Party and state authorities at various levels intervened in the protection of the monuments, either directly or indirectly. However, I would not look for the causes of the latent crisis of state conservation in these interferences, nor in insufficient legislation or its application, but above all in the moral qualities of the state preservation workers themselves. Members of the generation associated with the building of the heritage care system in interwar Czechoslovakia with a certain authority were leaving. The decisive group was now made up of reliable comrades who had been entrusted with work in this field as part of the cadre policy. In addition, young graduates were assigned here on placement, and other staff came on the basis of a network of acquaintances and personal affinities. For example, a former teacher who, as a protege of the director, divinely instructed how to do preservation work properly. A number of non-partisans professionals were deliberately kept as contract staff in unsystematized positions with uncertainty as to whether their contract would be renewed the following year. The transformation of the State Heritage Administration into the State Institute for Monuments Preservation and Nature Conservation and the requirements of class-based political vetting created pressure to reduce the existing staff. Desperate efforts to keep their job led to the denial of their own views. One of the pre-war workers commented on the situation as follows: the last year was already so turbulent in the monument administration, with the internal confusion, helplessness and cowardice, opportunism, that it was only with difficulty that we remained in place. Today's situation no longer guarantees a firm professional line, but neither determination, nor will, nor even a solid backbone. Co-workers were suddenly seen as competitors in their own career growth. One of the first victims of this hidden struggle was architect Josef Pošmourný. In the HEP action, Professor Oldřich Štefan, who in 1954 and 1960 led a team that carried out surveying work on historic houses in the conservation area, was also unjustly prosecuted. Both resisted the pressure of the investigators and refused the accusation, which was not based on factual evidence, but only on statements of co-accused who wanted to make their position easier by cooperating with the investigators and witnesses. Stefan was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment and Pošmourný to 4 years imprisonment, during which time both were assigned to the secret technical institute of the Ministry of the Interior, where the forced labor of imprisoned experts was used to prepare project documentation for buildings. All the experts became uncomfortable by their unwillingness to submit to political interests and to compromise. After returning from serving their sentences, despite their high level of expertise, none of them found the opportunity to work in preservation, perhaps so that their presence would not remind others of their moral failings. In one text, Max Dvořák likened the art historian to a doctor, where both bear an equally high moral responsibility to society. Human life, like cultural monuments, is irreplaceable, inevitably ending in their demise. This consciousness of high social responsibility for the state of the cultural heritage of the past was rapidly fading. In the late 1960s, architect Groha attempted to theoretically defend monument preservation against the wave of demolitions, destructions, and overestimation of rationalistic economics by incorporating it into broader context of our society humanistic relationship to historical monuments as part of the environment. The Prague Institute of Theory and History of Art, I would like to recall here the honorable memory of the architect Viktor Kotrba with the elaboration of a memorandum on the state of monument care at that time, attempted to initiate a discussion on the problems of the field. It is therefore gratifying that half a century later, younger colleagues of the same institute have prepared the present conference as a space for the exchange of experiences in professional research, which, although they relate to a bygone era, may still be relevant today. Thank you, dear colleague, very much for reminding us that there can be a huge difference between a standard and its execution. So the whole directions that preservation takes can be modified or changed. Unfortunately, we do not have much time for the discussion as we ran out of time, but all the questions that were written into the chat boxes on YouTube channels will be sent to you in your emails. But let's just mention a few questions that we got.
We have questions for colleagues from Croatia and from Romania related to whether at the time there was a cooperation with Czechoslovak preservationists. Could you please give a brief answer?
Should I start? Yes, yes, actually I wanted to include in the presentation, but then it would have been too long. There were exchanges, and it's a subject that I'm interested now to further develop. There were exchanges, there were visits of Czech architects to Romania. They were rather unimpressed with, especially with the methods of restoration and so on and so forth, but there were exchanges, and also in Romanian journals, specialized journals, there were reports on what was happening in Czechoslovakia. Of course, it was always only the good parts were presented, of course, and it was given as an example of good practice in restoration, especially in what concerns these urban reservations. It was like an important point for Romanian preservationists to look at.
Děkuji. Mohu se zeptat i pana kolegy?
May I ask Mr. Špikić?
Yeah, well, in this phase of research, I can only say that the main influences came from Poland in the late 50s and generally from the 60s, when the first Restoration Institute was established in Zagreb, and when the conservators and restorers made a field trip to Poland. Most probably they stopped also in Czech Republic. A lot of art historians from Croatia visited not just Prague, but also other sites. But I think that in this stage of research, I can only say that in the mentioned, what I mentioned in my presentation, this Milan Triennale meeting, also gathered, there was Jakub Pavel there, and he represented some examples from Czech Republic, from Czechoslovakia at the moment, and most probably they had some contacts, but it needs to be further researched. So basically what I tried to emphasize is, on one side, it was influences from Italy that have been covered for some political reasons because of the Yugoslavian Italian situation and relationships, and with Poland. So I cannot still in this stage of research answer more on the context.
Děkuji vám. S tím možná
Thank you. This is maybe related to the question for Mr. Kowalski, related to how Czech experts were seen in Slovakia at the time. Were the help welcome, or were they seen as competitors? Thank you for the question. It's not an easy one. I have evidence that in the late 1930s, there were some comments saying that we have some Czech restaurators around. After 1945, we do not have written evidence. In my presentation, I mentioned that all the institutional intentions, like establishing the Heritage Archive and all those processes of building a cultural infrastructure, part of this was leaving the responsibility and the powers to Slovak national bodies. So Prague was seen as an effort to centralize the system. In the 1940s and early 1950s, related to Yugoslavia, I see a problem that in that it was not possible to be in contact and have exchanges because Yugoslavia in the socialist bloc was a different country. It was not with the Soviet Union. Tito was named South Slovenian bourgeois. So there was this clash between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia was terra incognita until a certain point. So the exchanges could not have been very intensive. Thank you. Unfortunately, we will have to come to an end because we have another session, another panel coming. So as for the remaining questions that were sent in, we will send them to you. We will forward them to you. And if you are willing to answer them, to reply, we will be happy. So many thanks to all the panelists of this section of our conference. Many thanks for your excellent presentations showing the diversity of approaches in broader Central Europe. And I'm curious to see how these institutional matters will be further put into context in the remaining presentations of the conference. I'm happy we were able to meet here. Thank you very much for your time, for your participation, and goodbye.